Thanks very much, Andre. By the way, Chris's wife, Julie, and one of his staff people, Ann Irving, have already been introduced. What I'd like to add to that is Ann's father was about a 30-some-year member of this club till he died in 1982. We hope someday Ann will follow in his footsteps. The speaker today, if you were lucky, when he was introduced as a new member a year or so ago, you've already heard his version at that time of what was going on in the world. Because the day I introduced him as a new member, the Broncos speaker did not show up. So I just heard Chris speak to the Council of World Affairs in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I said, I know you didn't come prepared, but would you enlighten our club on the same speech that you gave at the Council of World Affairs? And he did it, and everybody afterwards said, we're sure glad the Broncos didn't show up. Now we understand what's going on in the world. Chris has been busy since he came from ambassador to Iraq to the dean of the Corwell School of International Studies at DU. He's been busy, and this coming February they will move into their new $22 million building that'll make that school the finest in the United States. And they've already got the finest leadership in Chris Hill and his experience. He was ambassador to Korea twice, to Macedonia, to Poland. I came here to DU right from being ambassador to Iraq. He was Undersecretary of State, Pacific region. He's negotiated peace treaties worldwide. He's just a fabulous guy that knows more about the world and going on a day-to-day basis. He's in touch with the State Department 24/7, and you see him on CNN all the time. So please welcome our member, Chris Hill.
Well, thank you very much, Grant, and thanks for recalling that day when I stood in for the Denver Broncos. But that was a wonderful introduction, Grant. But, you know, I'm from New England, and we like things a little less inflated. So I guess people got that joke. I'm very pleased about that. But anyway, thank you very much, Grant. And let me say it's such a pleasure to be with you once again, to be with Marlene, and of course have my wife here, Julie. Julie always makes sure I behave in these things. She doesn't like football jokes, but you know she'll let me get away with that one. I think you know it is for me. First of all, I'm a member here at Rotary. I can't say I make every Thursday meeting, but I'm very proud to be a member of this club because I think the Rotary Club, especially this Rotary Club in Denver, has done so much, first of all, across the board for the community, but also specifically to help make Denver the global, internationally focused city that it is becoming. I think every city in America needs to be much more internationally focused, and I think Rotary has really done a very good job in that regard for Denver. And I like to think that our Corwell School is also helping to be one of those sort of points of making Denver this very, very international city that it has become. We have some famous graduates, of course, Condoleezza Rice. Of course, we're named for Madeleine Albright's father. And another of our graduates is none other than the Iranian foreign minister, Javad Zarif, who many of you know has spent the last few months with John Kerry hammering out a very difficult agreement, but I think an agreement that has finally gained acceptance, or has not been refused, I guess is a better way to put it, in Washington, and an agreement that I think really has profound impact on what might be our relationship with Iran in the future, a very troubled relationship in the past, but a relationship that I think will have will probably grow in the future. I was in New York last Monday and I saw Zarif, and to hear him talk, I mean, he understands that this agreement is more than a nuclear agreement. It's an agreement that I think really tries to address some of the underlying issues of the U.S. relationship with Iran, a country of some 80 million people. You know, whenever you have a foreign policy issue, check the map. And when you check the map, you will see that Iran is a serious country, and a country that we need to kind of figure out a better way forward on. And I think what's particularly important about this agreement is, and I've felt this for several months, you know, whatever one thinks of the details, I mean, could we have gotten those 4 Americans released? I can assure you our negotiators didn't just forget. I mean, they obviously tried, and they weren't able to get that done. So there are a lot of things that, you know, I think fall short of some of the things we wanted to see in that agreement. But I think the agreement is very much now into an implementation phase. And of course, one of the key questions will be how are you going to be able to verify things? How, you know, will we have the international inspectors that we need? And we're supposed to have those people who will be able to determine whether there's a clandestine program going on, determine whether the Iranians are living up to what they need to live up to, and, you know, questions directly related to the agreement. But I think probably equally important will be that agreement's effect on our relations within the Arab Middle East. You know, I think many Americans understood that the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, was very much, how to put it, contained his enthusiasm for that agreement. But I think probably fewer Americans understood that where the agreement really encountered a lot of resistance was from our Sunni Arab friends. And it's precisely among the Sunni Arabs who feel that somehow the U.S. is somehow going back to the future, that is going back to the relationship we had with Iran when it was under the Shah and a staunch American ally, and that somehow we've kind of given up on the Arab world and we're switching back to a special relationship with Iran. So I don't think that's the case. I would argue we have a long way to go before we have a special relationship with a country that, after all, has kind of 2 political systems. One, a sort of secular system with elections and prime ministers, and as in the case of the University of Denver alumnus, Javed Zarif has a foreign minister, et cetera. Then there's a whole parallel government structure there, which is under what have fondly become known as the mullahs. And this is these are a group of people who don't necessarily share the commitment of other Iranians or the commitment of other people in the world to somehow bring Iran into the international structure. These are people who sort of who want to see Iran somewhat out of that structure, and Iran, which counts among its friends such wonderful places as North Korea. I spent a lot of time with those people. They are people truly only a mother can love, and yet the Iranians have had kind of a close relationship there, and a distant relationship with the countries that they really ought to be thinking of in their future. When Javed Zarif spoke last Monday, and by the way, we're having a University of Denver event with him in New York this coming Monday, but he said this agreement, this nuclear agreement with Iran, is not so much a nuclear agreement to prevent us from having a nuclear weapon, because he said to the people assembled there, we're not interested in a nuclear weapon. But if you're worried about us having a nuclear weapon at some point in the future, the best thing you can do is have this agreement, because this will ensure that we have more relations with the rest of the world, and that in those relations with the rest of the world, we're going to be able to, that will be a kind of insurance policy. That is, we will continue to want those relationships and understand that they would be imperiled by any eventual decision to have a nuclear weapons program. But in the meantime, we can see that in the Middle East, the Arab Middle East, there is a considerable concern about Iran. I think to understand the view of countries like Saudi Arabia toward the United States, I think many Americans understood that the continued support of the United States for Israel as a country that is close American ally and for many years at war with all of its neighbors. For many people, they thought, aha, that is the issue that divides the United States from Saudi Arabia, the fact that the United States is a staunch ally of a country that many Arabs find anathema. That is really not emerging as the big problem. What happened in 2003, the U.S. decision to intervene, to go into Iraq, and to take a Sunni-led country which was Iraq. Now, bear in mind, Iraq had the percentage of Arab Iraqis who are Sunni was some 20%, with the Shia, and the Shia are what the Iranians are. Though the Shia in Iraq were some 60%, and yet Iraq, as an Arab country, was under the Sunnis. It's important to understand this because they were under Sunnis, albeit a minority Sunnis, for many centuries. And when we flipped it to being a Shia-led country, the Sunni Arabs throughout the Arab world, but especially in Saudi Arabia, looking at their northern border, suddenly saw a Shia state. And when they look over to the east, they see another Shia state, Iran. So now they see Iraq and Iran both Shia, and in the case of Iraq, something that the U.S., in their view, created. And so they are very nervous about all of this. They see Shia encroaching not only in Iraq, thanks to our help in their view, but also they see Shia emboldened and strengthened in places like southern Lebanon, and something called Hezbollah. Hezbollah has for many years been branded a terrorist organization by the United States and by many other countries. Hezbollah is a Shia group, and they have, over the years, received a lot of assistance from Iran. So the Saudis are looking at this Shia strength in Lebanon. They're seeing the Shia regime under Bashar al-Assad in Syria, also supported by Shia groups from Hezbollah. And then they see Iraq, which is Shia. And then they see Iran, which they feel has been aggressively trying to spread its influence. And they look at us and they say, what are you doing? And so from the point of view of the U.S., we are going to have to, if we're going to maintain this agreement with Iran, and I suspect we will, I really don't care if the next administration is the Donald Trump administration. I very much suspect we're going to keep this agreement. I think it would be quite astounding if we somehow pulled out of it and very much created huge problems with our allies, such as the French and the British and the Germans and others. So I think we're going to keep with this agreement. But at the same time, we have to be more involved in the Middle East systematically, diplomatically, and with an idea to seeing what we can do to help calm that region down. Now, as we meet today, it's worth bearing in mind just 3 days ago, I think today is Thursday, and on Monday, our president met with the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. Now, there are a lot of good reasons why Putin is not exactly everyone's flavor of the month. He, after all, essentially destabilized his neighbor, his southern neighbor, Ukraine, continues to destabilize the situation in eastern Ukraine, and actually grabbed a piece of territory from Ukraine. He has not been someone we've been able to work with on things, and he's been very aggressive and very much focused on the need to somehow bring Russia back, albeit not as the Soviet Union, but as a country that will somehow play in the world again. So he looks at the situation in Syria. He sees a minority government in Syria, and Syria has a vast Sunni majority, just as Iraq had a vast Shia majority, and just as our invasion in Iraq restored power to the Shia majority, in Syria, he wants to maintain that the Shia minority there continues to hold power. It would be like somebody invading Iraq for the purpose of keeping Saddam Hussein in Iraq. So Putin has kept these close relations with with Bashar al-Assad. And the consequence now is that he's actually brought forces onto the ground. We knew about this. Believe me, when forces move, you know about this weeks ago. It could not have been a surprise to our administration. But the real issue now is, as we see these Russian forces on the ground in Syria, what are they doing there, and what are we going to do about it? It's very clear Russia wants to be a player. It's equally clear Russia does not think that we should be seeking the ouster of regimes, even terrible regimes like Assad's regime. So at the same time, it's very clear that Russia has essentially made a decision to prop up that regime and to go after the enemies of that regime. Now, one of the problems we have is that some 4 years ago, the U.S. decided not only did we not like Assad, we were not going to deal with him, and we were going to call for his overthrow. In fact, we did call for his overthrow. We sent our ambassador down to talk to the Sunni opposition in southern Syria, and when that happened, our ambassador never had another consequential meeting in Damascus. Usually, foreign countries, it's one thing to deal with the opposition. It's another thing to deal with an opposition that the government determines is a very dangerous and a very violent opposition, and there's certainly a case to be made for much of this Sunni opposition in Syria. So essentially, we lost all leverage. They had zero leverage after that with the Damascus regime. At the same time, within the Sunni community, out of all of these various militia groups, out of all of these various forces on the ground seeking to overthrow this regime under Assad and put a Sunni majority regime into Syria, of all those forces, the ones that have emerged are the Islamic State, which is an organization, to put it gently, that does not share our values. Another one is the al-Nusra Front, which is essentially a sort of franchised al-Qaeda operation. And then there's several others being supported by other external elements in the Middle East. And none of those are ones that we can really work with. So the U.S. lost any influence to deal with the government. We have no influence with most of the opposition. And so we should not be surprised when Russia, by maintaining a good relationship with the government in Damascus, has that government's permission to be on the ground. So we are in a situation where Russia is on the ground. We don't want them there. We don't trust their motives. And yet we have very little leverage with anyone on the ground there. Now, to be sure, we have allies in the world. Certainly, we are not the only country worried about the Russian presence. Certainly the French, the British, and others worry about the Russian presence. But our diplomacy put us in a position where we have no one to talk to. And when you have put yourself in a position where you have no one to talk to, you should not be surprised if you are gradually marginalized from the situation. That has got to change in some way. Now, should we be talking to Assad? After all, 4 years ago, we said we'd never talk to him. I would mention the following historical analogy. 20 years ago this month, we met in a place called Wright-Patterson Air Base near Dayton, Ohio, to end the Bosnian War. By the way, Bosnia is not exactly got Denver's economy, but it's nonetheless, no one's getting shot at. It's basically going okay, and it's been 20 years. During the last few days of the Bosnian, of these negotiations, Ambassador Holbrooke and I went to see the Serb leader, who was part of the Serb delegation, and said to him, "We have agreed on a territorial map." He said, "I know, that's really good. We have agreed on a new constitution for Bosnia." He said, "I know, it's excellent. We've agreed on elections. We've agreed on how we're going to supervise elections. We've agreed on a force to keep peace there, that is a NATO force with some other countries. But, Mr. Milosevic, we are not going to agree that any of these Bosnian Serb war criminals should participate in the future of Bosnia." Milosevic says that's a terrible mistake. These people have popularity there. They have political power. You can't just exclude them. We said, I know you don't want them excluded, but we have to exclude them. They cannot be part of the future of Bosnia. In fact, one of them, who is the Bosnian Serb president, a guy named Radovan Karadzic, is today, as we speak, sitting in a jail cell in The Hague under a war crimes indictment. So Milosevic looked at all that we had done. He looked at the map. He looked at the elections. He looked at the Constitution. He said, okay, we'll move forward. So why did he move forward on excluding Bosnian Serb representation? The answer was we had done 95% of the job. Now, what percentage of the job of creating a sort of diplomatic space and political space for Syria in the future have we done? And the answer is pretty close to zero. We have said we're going to arm some of these moderates, but we frankly had some trouble finding moderates there. And even if you find them, it's a little difficult to determine whether they're moderates or not. Do you give them a questionnaire? Do you say, how do you feel about yourself? A, moderate. B, very moderate. C, not so moderate today. How do you do that? And the answer is, it's very difficult. And so we found that we've equipped and armed people who, a day after they enter the battlefield, turn their weapons over to either ISIS or al-Nusra. So these people are not turning out to be moderate, and we, I don't think, could find a moderate if our life depended on it. I think what we need to do is to go forward with a diplomatic process with Syria, akin to the kinds of things we did in Bosnia. It is very discouraging that only 3 days ago, as I mentioned, our president met with President Putin. Because after all, I mean, we should have had this kind of discussion with him. And yet, because of the way our whole political system is geared these days, if our president talks to somebody that we consider a bad guy, then we kind of get angry with our president. So our president, in order to sit down with Putin the other day, had to scowl and growl at the press and look like this was the worst thing that ever happened in his life. And of course, the newspapers in this country are very pleased that our president is so displeased at having to meet with Putin. I think what you have to do when you go meet with someone like Putin is put away the scowls and remember what your objective is in the meeting. Is it to look unhappy to the press, or is it to try to hammer out some kind of political deal? I think we need to get a little more serious in the future and really focus on what the political arrangements can be with Syria. Just when you thought it couldn't get worse, it got worse with Russian troops on the ground. And moreover, I would call your attention to last week's crisis, or 2 weeks ago, when all of these Syrian refugees started showing up and mainly they were Syrian, there were others, and they start showing up in places like Hungary in Europe. And so everyone's blaming the Hungarians for failing in their moral responsibilities to help these people. Just remember one thing. When we call for regime change, as we did 4 years ago, that is, we need to get rid of Assad, we need to remember that when you tell a dictator he's got to leave, rarely in history has the dictator said, oh, you want me gone? Well, let me get my hat and coat and I'm out of here. So what you're saying is we believe in the use of force to get rid of you. The use of force means war. We haven't fought the war ourselves. We've had various others in Syria fighting the war, sometimes getting our weapons, sometimes getting weapons from the Saudis, etc. So when you call for regime change, you're essentially calling for war. And when you call for war, you're calling for refugees. So I think those people who live so many thousand miles away from Syria calling for war, I suggest that they host a refugee family in their living room, because refugees are a direct consequence of war. And I think people need to understand that when you call for something like that, when you think that's a solution, you'd better be prepared to live with some of the downstream consequences of that solution. So I think we've got a tough row ahead. Clearly, we need to make sure that we don't start shooting down Russian planes, or they don't shoot down our planes. This could take a terrible situation and make it worse. But I think perhaps in the situation getting so tough and so strained right now, this might be a time to have some serious discussions with the Russians about what the political arrangements going forward. We cannot be talking to Assad. We're not going to reverse what we did 4 years ago. But I think we can give a sort of wink of the eye and have the Russians talk to Assad and see if there can be some arrangement along the lines of Syria remains within its international borders. Syria has a very decentralized system that is almost a canton system, because the Christian areas of Syria, which, by the way, continue to support Assad, they have no interest in living in Sunnistan. So we need to make sure that those localized areas are able to maintain their broad autonomy. I think we need to help Syria create some kind of parliamentary structure. And then, as everyone ridicules this and saying it's too little too late, you'll find, as we found in Bosnia, people will come back to it, because I think, frankly, it's the only game in town right now, and that we're going to have to set something up, set up what the political arrangements are going forward. Because until people have a clear idea of what their futures are, I think it's very clear that we are going to have a difficult time ending this brutal war. So I think with those kind of not very inspiring comments, I think perhaps we can go to some questions. Okay. Sorry. I can't see anything here, by the way, so, oh.
Chris, let's fast forward, if we could, to the second week in November in 2016. There's a new president, and you're sitting down with him as the Secretary of State, and you're to advise him or her with regards to the policies that they should take forth in the Middle East, the top 3 or 4 things that you tried to accomplish during their 4 years in office. How would that conversation go?
I think sitting down with the new president, the first point to make is, Mr. President, you're going to have to set some priorities. There are a lot of tough situations out there in the world. Many of them are truly tragic from a human rights perspective. But I think, Mr. President, we need to set priorities on the basis of what is in the interests of our country to solve. And which is not to say we don't want to solve things, but we need to solve certain things first. I would make the case to the President that this continued situation in the Middle East is dangerous for our interests. It's dangerous for the interests of our allies, and therefore for our interests. And that I think we need to demonstrate to the world that we consider the Middle East a top echelon issue that we need to address. I think parenthetically, our president, and as someone who worked on East Asia, I fully understood the idea that we needed to make this kind of pivot, this rebalancing over to East Asia. There are some very important countries there, China, you name it. There are lots of important countries. The unintended consequence of that was the sense that we didn't really care anymore about the Middle East, and I think we paid for that dearly. So I would say to the President, we need early on a real level of effort communicated to the American people. Secondly, I think the President needs to kind of lay out what exactly are our interests. Obviously, we would like democracy in the Middle East. But I think it is important to emphasize to the American people that we need a Middle East that is stable, that that involves reinforcing the strength of these nation states there. One of the problems of the Arab Spring, the Arab thing really, was that nation states were weakened. And when they were weakened, when some of these regimes were toppled, people didn't just say, well, good thing, now we can work on our democracy. They found instead, once those nation states were weakened, they found refuge in other forms of loyalty, such as tribalism and sectarianism. So I would say to the President, we need to strengthen the nation states there. Now, the President might say, well, what am I going to do about Egypt? I mean, Egypt, they serious human rights problems. And I would make the point as a general proposition, doesn't always work, but it works more than 50% of the time. The way to make a country behave better is to be closer to that country. You know, when you stand back and wag your finger at a country, I mean this finger, I mean, if you do that, the chances are the country is going to lose patience with you and is not going to listen. So I think in diplomacy, like in business, like in a lot of things, the best way to affect a country is to get a little closer. So I think we need to really work with countries like Egypt, make sure they understand that we're on the same side. And then you can do, as I personally have done in many cases. I remember springing some Greeks out of Albania by appealing to the Albanian president, and he knew me very well. He said, look, for the relationship with the U.S., this is going to hurt me domestically, but for the relationship with you, I'm going to release these guys because I could see this is how we need to work this. So I would emphasize to the president the need to really demonstrate that to these countries we want them to be stable, we want them to get through this, we want to see their economies improve, etc. I think we need to have that kind of, in that diplomacy in this sort of circle of countries in the Middle East. I would send the kind of high-level mission that we sent to the Saudis on the occasion of the death of their last king. I would try to make it as bipartisan as possible. And I would emphasize to the president, when you get some cheap shot from someone from the other party in Congress, ignore it. They'll continue to take cheap shots at you. You've got to take the high road and reach out to our other party. We need to start building a broader and a bilateral consensus on these international issues. It's not going to come immediately, but if you are perceived as trying to do that, the press will come around, and eventually the American people will see what you're doing, and eventually the other party will understand that there's no percentages and constantly complaining about the president, and they will come with you. So we've got to do that as well. So there's this diplomacy we need within among Middle East states. There's our own domestic thing, and then a broader diplomacy of working with our allies and frankly, partners like Russia. I think if we could get together with Russia, as we did in Bosnia, and have a common point of view on what to do with Syria, and we can work that out with some of the other European countries and come up with what we called in Bosnia the contact group plan, I think we could settle it down. Right now, we're not helping Syria, and frankly, Syria is leading to even more dangerous splits with countries like Russia, and we've got to stop that now. So I would kind of go on that basis. And as for sending U.S. troops and things like that, when you use force, it is a serious means to a serious ends, and it should be the last thing you do. I don't rule it out, but it should not be the first thing you do. It should be the last thing you do. And when generals come up to you and say they have the political answers, you tell them, you're out of your lane, General. You need to train up your troops in case we need you. Okay.
Ambassador, thanks for being here. Earlier you said in Syria that we didn't have anybody to talk to.
Yeah.
Can you address that?
Yeah, I mean, we essentially wrote off the Alawite regime. I call them Shia. They're a sect of Shiism, but it's really a tribal affiliation called the Alawites. They're about 15% of the population of Syria. They've been running the place. They've had a role in Syria, in all of Syria's modern history, and running the place almost exclusively since about 1970. We have no ties to the Alawite regime. On the Sunni side of the ledger, they're a Muslim Brotherhood. We have really no ties there. We have certainly no ties with ISIS and no ties with some of these other groups that tend to be more Islamist, represented by groups such as al-Nusra. So we have essentially no one on the ground that we can talk to. We do have Syrians who live in places like London or who might live in places like Dubai, and we love to talk to those people who also live in Washington, but they don't have fighters on the ground. And for us to think, oh, we can build up their fighters on the ground and then they'll be relevant, that is a tall order, and I don't think that's the way to go about it. Okay.